Welcome to this webinar, New Perspectives on Anticipatory Architecture. My name is Ruth Slavid and I'm chairing this today on behalf of Architecture Today, and we're with our content partner, Schüco as well. So we are anticipating a great day, and that's going to be the last pun I make, I hope. I will tell you a little more in a moment about the way this is going to run. But before I do, I'm delighted to introduce Sean Butler, who is Commercial Director of Schüco UK.
Welcome to the latest in our series of AT Schüco webinars. Today, we will look at the challenge of designing buildings that anticipate and perhaps facilitate changes in the years ahead. This isn't a new phenomenon. Virtually every building of a certain age has had to withstand or adapt to change. But developments in technology, changes in behaviour, and the quest for safer, more sustainable environments all call for a constant re-evaluation of our building stock. And of course, COVID-19 has changed everything we thought we knew about the distinctions between places to work, rest, learn and play. This raises fundamental questions. What is the future of the office? Can buildings really incorporate the disparate needs of work, leisure, exercise and education? And can we design the building stock now that will be capable of adapting to change in the future based on economic, environmental or social change? At Schüco, we understand that the buildings we construct today need to be fit for purpose not just now, but for generations to come. We need to be thinking about how we can design buildings that are sufficiently flexible to withstand unforeseen changes to the way we live and work in the decades ahead. So I'm delighted that we have three expert speakers who will explore a range of approaches to help solve this conundrum. Thank you once again for joining us. I'll now pass you to Ruth, who is chairing today's event.
Thank you, Sean. I think it's fascinating that we are, instead of just talking about briefs to design something we know about, we're talking about briefs to design things we don't know about. We've got three excellent speakers. I just explain a little bit to you about how the morning is going to run. After each speaker, there will be a very short Q&A session, and then there will be a longer discussion at the end. So as you're listening to the speakers, if anything occurs to you that you'd like to ask, please do press the button and write in your question, and we will answer as many questions as we possibly can, both either after the presentations or, as I said, at the end. So we have, as I said, three speakers. Really happy we're going to hear from Matthew Dearlove, who is Head of Design at Night Dragon Developments. And we're also going to hear from Philip Turner, Director at AHMM. But before those two, I am delighted to introduce Despina Katsikakis, who is Executive Partner, Global Head of Total Workplace at Cushman Wakefield. Despina.
Thank you. It's great to be here today and to share some of our research and thinking around what we should be designing for coming out of the pandemic, what the implications will be for office buildings. We took a very much an evidence-based approach to how we were looking at the impact of the pandemic by pivoting our experience per square foot proprietary tool to experience per square foot at home, and offering it to our clients starting in the middle of last year, and then continuously monitoring the data every few months throughout. We've had over 75,000 people participate across 100 countries, and we have over 3 million data points. And the information that we've been gathering is particularly interesting. What we have found on the far left of the screen, you see, is that 75% of people have been able to continue to effectively focus and collaborate while working remotely. And interestingly, 90% of them now feel they're trusted by their managers to work remotely. However, 1 in 2 people are struggling to feel connected to their colleagues and to company culture. And 1 in 2 people actually feel their well-being has been suffering because they're not taking enough time away from work. This is particularly challenging for younger generations, where we find 70% of them are actually struggling with caregiver responsibilities and with inadequate workspace at home. So many challenges to solve for. However, what it has shown us is that 78% of people actually expect to have choice moving forward, and they want to have flexibility to decide where to work from. So when we begin to look at what does that mean for repurposing the office, and we get into the granularity of the data, no surprises there that socializing, collaborating, having access to tools, networking with people, being able to share, mentor, learn are really critical as to why people want to come into the office. But at the same time, people still want to work remotely in order to save commute time, have flexibility, be able to focus more. But it's important to note that as we look at this really critical element to engagement, which is feeling connected to colleagues and culture, 73% of people working from the office are feeling that, as opposed to 50% working from home. So the office has a very important role to play. But it has an important role to play as part of a much more complex workplace ecosystem, a variety of locations and experiences that will support convenience, functionality, and well-being. That is likely to be our home. It's likely to be areas within local communities that allow us to have short commutes, but still access to people and services. It is very much around on-demand event space and third places and cities, but critically, the office still becomes a very important destination, an inspiring destination to support collaboration, mentoring, learning, and innovation. And this is very important in terms of how we're going to design for the future of offices. But we need to think about, what does that mean? When we talk about an ecosystem, we tend to hear a lot of press at the moment around, are people coming back to the office or working remotely? And we like to stress that the future is not binary. It's not either being in the office or being remote. In fact, when we look at data on engagement, and the diagram on the left, which is a Gallup poll on engagement, indicates that people that are in the office all of the time or in the office none of the time have the lowest engagement scores. It's really when you're in the office about 60 to 80% that your engagement score peaks. And then when we look at that in terms of what corporate occupiers are planning, the diagram on the right is some joint research we recently did with CoreNet. And you can see on the left-hand side that corporate real estate executives were estimating hybrid work expectations to be 29% pre-pandemic. And since the pandemic, they see that moving to more than 80%. So people working in a dynamic way will increase to about 80% possibly. That's a big, big amount of people. And what's critical to understand when we look at so much more of the office population having flexibility and working in a more dynamic way is, what does that mean? So we did some modeling to understand the probability of running into people when you reduce your office attendance from 5 days a week to 2 days a week. And what you see on the left-hand side here is that when you come into the same workplace with your colleagues 5 days a week, your probability of running into people is about 88%. When that is reduced to 2 days a week, that drops to 29%. And even for smaller teams, the probability of 50% of the team being in the office at any given day drops down to 12%. So what this is telling us is that whilst we want flexibility, it is absolutely critical for that flexibility to be actively managed so that when we do come into the office, we are coming in and running into and meeting the people that will drive our engagement and our effectiveness to do our work better. This is a very important issue as to how we plan for the future workplace. And what we're currently doing is we have pivoted our experience per square foot into 2.0, which begins to develop different profiles to define particular workplace components that will be appropriate to who will come into the office, why do they come in, what happens when they're actually in the office, what are the tasks that they will be doing, and how is the office designed to respond to those tasks, whilst at the same time ensuring that we're supporting virtual work. This is driving us to look at a number of potential implications. So the way space is currently allocated is no longer going to be viable, but we're seeing two different optionalities. Organizations are either realigning space, so within the same footprint, driving up more shared and amenity space to enhance connection and collaboration, or they're actually optimizing both space and experience by leveraging that ecosystem of different work environments and regaining things like lost commute time into productivity and enabling their colleagues to use less space, but in better ways. What that means is that we're starting to really look at some interesting implications in terms of the importance of more blurring of activities, this ability to think about how we work, live, learn, and combine leisure across not just buildings, but city quarters. The importance of looking at the workplace will not just be about the workplace itself, but actually the surrounding area, the amenities, the experiences that it provides to inspire people to come to the office. And when we look at the way these elements come together, the home base, the home, is a place we control very much on a personal level. We will, however, be using many more activities across common spaces, across public spaces. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of the pandemic is I think it's reinforced the focus on the role of public realm and third places to provide spatial equity, community, and experience. We're likely to see the ground floors of office buildings become much more permeable and connected to public space, to events, to the opportunity to bring in public and create much more layered experiences of common and personal space. So a very exciting time to connect the building to the city in completely new ways. As we look, though, into the building itself, it's important to begin to define the difference between virtual work and space and physical space. Virtual workspace tends to be very personal and very convenient. Therefore, physical space needs to become much more engaging and memorable. We go to certain places when we have the choice to go to them, to have those memorable experiences, to have serendipitous encounters, to gain mentoring. So this is a tremendous design opportunity for the office building, because design of physical spaces can now be focused on values, on brand, on culture and community. And we need to think of the office as a social condenser for collaboration. It will also be layered with much more real-time data to enable us to drive those buildings more intermittently and intensively and have more critical performance criteria. So what does that mean in terms of the emerging insights? We're certainly at a place where we can begin to really clearly start to make hypotheses about what are the activities that we can best do in person, such as those knowledge transfers, collaboration, social interactions, and what the actual physical characteristics we need to design to really enable those will be. One of the most challenging ones will be the activities that we will be doing in a hybrid way. That would mean that some people will physically be together while others might dial in remotely. So how do we create frictionless, equitable experiences for people that are in the room and for those that are not? That will require new types of interactive project spaces and meeting rooms with video and smart boards to create that same level of digital equity that we've experienced through virtual collaboration in the last year. And then lastly, understand the activities that best can happen remotely, such as process-driven or formal meetings or focused work, and where those will happen, most likely in people's homes or third spaces, and how we support them. So when we look more specifically at what this might mean for implications on interior space allocation, typically today, 60% of office interiors are allocated to individual workspaces. We expect those to be reduced to about half of that amount of space allocated to individual work. And that space redistributed to collaborative workspaces, which will make up about half of the space in buildings, and to support spaces, social spaces, and well-being, which will increase from about 5% today to about 20% in the future. The next set of implications are really exciting, and this is around emerging technology, real-time data, and user interfaces. I think this is where we will find the most evolution in the next few years. Our ability to use real-time data to support well-being, how the building responds to our well-being. Interior air quality is a great example. We've all become air quality experts in the last few months. So being able to track how the air quality in the building affects our day-to-day work will be amazing. How does the building respond to our experience? Health and safety, testing and tracing. We've already seen many landlords and many occupiers put in place. The second layer, which technology can really help us drive, is optimization of both space and carbon. The ability to manage with real-time data, space and capacity management, building access, and energy and sustainability targets will only increase as we move forward. And the last pillar will be around engagement. How do we ensure that people can find their team, can have effective collaboration? How do we manage communities and hospitality and hybrid working effectiveness? These are really, really amazing areas of innovation at the moment. And I think there's a new app almost daily being launched to try and support one of these initiatives. What we're also seeing, of course, is new commercial building models. This is a building that was actually completed just a few months ago in the middle of lockdown, 22 Bishopsgate in the City of London. I was part of creating the workplace vision for this project in 2015. And the vision behind this project was to create a vertical village, an immersive community of authentic amenities and services. The vertical village that I'm describing is a building that is 1.3 million square feet of lettable space. And in addition to that space, it provides 100,000 square feet of active community and amenity space. All sorts of spaces, from food and drink, the largest bike park in the City of London, a gym, but not just any gym, a gym with a climbing wall on the 25th floor overlooking the City of London. In addition to that, the building provides 50,000 square feet of flex and event space managed by Convene. So the occupiers within the building can at any moment have access to meeting rooms, to event spaces, to additional desks as their business adapts. This is the first building to implement the Microsoft Intelligent BMS system, which allows cloud-based analytics and the ability of clients to plug in their devices to be able to access facial recognition software and have open framework 5G capabilities anywhere. It's also the first building to have gained Core and Shell WELL Gold certification and Platinum Wired certification. So what we're seeing in this type of model is a building that pulls together all of the trends that we have seen in recent years, which in a post-pandemic world are no longer trends. They will now be basic expectations, because occupiers will expect their landlord to provide more than just a building, but a destination that is managed and curated to create unique experiences for their people, to bring that social condensing that I described earlier, and at the same time, to be able to support their agility, the flexibility, and resiliency to changing business demand. As we look to this type of building and these types of expectations, we will increasingly be shifting our expectations of performance from cost to value. It is not good enough anymore to just reduce space and reduce cost. It is important to focus on reducing the right things. So decreasing useless space, wasted time, absenteeism, stress, carbon, and outdated policies, and instead focusing on both individual and team productivity, but also inspiration and experience through increasing employee engagement, inclusion, ideas, collaboration, trust, resilience, and well-being. The role of buildings to drive this moving forward will be critical. But in order for us to design a successful transformation towards a hybrid total workplace ecosystem, we need more than just the design of buildings. We need an integrated, multidisciplined approach that brings together a variety of what typically would have been diverse functions and budgets and aligned goals to drive towards employee experience. It's important to recognize that when we look at savings in any one of these areas, we need to reinvest in another. And in order to do that, we cannot take an approach that gives us a final design solution, but we need to take an agile product design approach, an iterative design approach to introduce hybrid working pilots and to test and iterate and engage the workforce and employees actively. Move-in is no longer going to be the final objective, but move-in will be just one step in the process. And I think it's going to be a very exciting time to create very dynamic and iterative building solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Despina. That was fascinating, not least because of the enormous amount of research that you've done. I don't think I can even name 100 countries. But I was interested that actually a lot of what you said in this research seemed to confirm things that we felt instinctively. And I just wondered, what surprised you most in the research?
Two things surprised us. First was the experience of younger people. We assumed that younger people, being more tech savvy, would actually adapt to remote working better. But what we found, given the challenges that I raised earlier, was that they were struggling the most. They were missing social capital within their organizations, and they were missing space at home, and all of the things that help them build their careers, like mentoring and making those connections. Baby boomers, on the other hand, who were the most skeptical around remote working, had the best experience of all. Because they had both the social capital and the space. Now, that's a great opportunity because, of course, baby boomers still are the main decision makers in most organizations. So given that sense of comfort that they've had in the last few months, that should help accelerate the process of new models moving forward.
That's great. And I'm just going to ask you really quickly, what do you think this is going to do to overall demand for office space? Is it going to stay the same? Are we going to want less, or are we actually going to want more?
Well, I think this is a really interesting question. Obviously, the crystal ball point, right? But overall, rather than thinking about less space, the majority of our clients are looking at different space. So redefining the space that they currently have to actually do different things. And there are two interesting economic answers to this. When we look at the employment speed over the next 3 to 5 years of the office-based roles, employment increases to allow for similar demand of office space, but a real drive to quality, different types of environments, different pressures on the office environment to be that destination that I was describing earlier.
Thank you very much. Lots more to talk about, and we will talk later. And as I said to everybody watching this, do keep your questions coming in, please. But now I'm going to pass on to our second speaker, who is Matthew Dearlove, who is Head of Design at Night Dragon Developments. Matthew.
Well, it's great to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part. So I'm here to talk to you a bit about the Design District, which is a permanent home for the creative industries. It's 16 buildings by 8 architects, and it's opening this summer at the heart of the Greenwich Peninsula. For those of you who don't know, the Greenwich Peninsula is one of the largest regeneration sites in Europe. Certainly in the UK, it's 150-acre site. We're building 15,000 homes over the course of the next 15 to 20 years. It's had a gross value of about £8.5 billion, and we're surrounded by 1.5 miles of the River Thames. And probably the easiest way for you to locate it in London is you can see the dome at the top and the proximity to Canary Wharf. We currently have probably about 5,000 to 6,000 residents on site. We've built nearly 4,000 homes. Obviously, the O2 is a major attractor to the site, and the Design District is probably our first major sort of mixed use scheme in terms of bringing employment to the peninsula as part of the wider master plan. And you can see the Design District is just hidden in there, right at the heart of the peninsula. So in 2015, we commissioned Allies & Morrison to do a new master plan for the peninsula. And originally there was a master plan by Terry Farrell, which was done shortly after the millennium. And we took over the scheme in, I think, 2013. Night Dragon took over and redesigned the master plan in 2015 with the design district right at the heart of it. The idea behind the original master plan was to increase the residential capacity on the site, but also reorganize the employment uses. And one of the things that really struck the team at the beginning of the project was the creative industries that were already on the site. So obviously the O2 being here, a major attractor for the entertainment industry. Also Ravensbourne Art College was already based here. And so we had 2,500 students who graduating each year actually often didn't stay within the borough. So there's a sort of poor retention of graduates from the school. So that was something we were keen to tackle. And as part of the scheme at the time, we were proposing some film studios, which you can see to the bottom left of the master plan close to the gas holder site. This has actually now changed in terms of the film studios are going to Dagenham and Redbridge, and we are now proposing some more residential and employment in that pocket of the master plan that's coming forward at the moment. However, the idea behind the design district was it sat at the heart of the peninsula and linked these different things together. So you could have recording spaces or people working in A&R, you'd have graduates being able to come out of the Ravensbourne, and other industries that were co-locating due to the film studios could come and find a home there. So the idea was that if you were involved in CGIs or set design or makeup, that they might have a base there. And in 2016, we had a lot of residential buildings coming forward, and we decided that it was a perfect time to bring the design district forward as a scheme. And we then started really to focus on how we could attract the creative industries to the peninsula and what type of environment they would want to be in. So at the outset of the project, we set out some key principles. And the first one was that it really had to be low cost. We had to have an affordable entry point for the creative industries. We know how tough it is in terms of some of the rents in London for creatives and artists to find a home, certainly within the sort of zones 1 to 4. And so that was really important. The other thing we wanted was it had to be diverse. We wanted a diversity of occupiers, and we wanted it to be productive. So the idea that people actually made things, you might have, instead of sort of made in the UK, it would say made on Greenwich Peninsula, made in the design district. That was a really important idea. And that it was small scale. So the buildings on the peninsula are predominantly tall buildings. And obviously we have the river around us, we have this sort of fantastic light, and you have an environment that can take that height. But we wanted a neighborhood that was really a sort of counterpoint to those, and that we thought would create a kind of human scale and intimate sort of environment for people. We also wanted it to be open, so that it wasn't just a single building carved up into lots of smaller studio spaces, but that it was a place. So it had streets and squares, it was accessible, it was immersive. And that's the last principle, that it was a place that you could discover, you could wander around, and you could find the things that people were making, or find an interesting space to be in. At the same time, we started to try and think through how those buildings might work. And in terms of the sort of vertical trend of the buildings, we thought that on the ground floor, where things needed to be noisy and messy, where there were workshops, those should be based on the ground floor, so they could open out, and that those floor plates could accommodate heavy things. Then on the sort of middle floors, we felt that those needed to be more adaptable, so they're open plan, there's more desk-based activities. If you're a graphic designer or a fashion designer or an architect, you might come into one of those spaces. And then on the top of the buildings, we wanted to really take advantage of the natural light, the studio spaces, so they were well lit, and we thought of those as being predominantly photography studios or painting studios. And those elements all fed into the brief, alongside wanting to sort of take advantage of some little moments where we could, so that there were roof terraces where possible, that the courtyards were a really important part of giving the sort of the environment to the buildings and the sort of character to the place, and that we could find efficiencies where possible within the buildings. So within the cores, for example, the buildings are shallow floor plates, so there is only one means of escape. which is the central core, so one lift, one staircase. The entrances are self-managed, so there isn't a receptionist. If you ring the buzzer, someone will come down and open the door for you. And so we wanted to keep things as lean as possible. And I think that was really also speaking to keeping those rents low. That was that sort of core driver. We iterated on the master plan a great deal. And that focus on thinking about the elements I just discussed really brought us to a set of buildings which had these shallow floor plates. One that was to allow for natural ventilation, obviously that single core, but also it started to form an environment where we could carve out those public spaces. So there's a central courtyard or a central main square, which gets 50% of direct sunlight at lunchtime. That was the key, that we wanted that pocket of sun for people to go and find in the middle of the day. And then there's 4 courtyards. And so you can see these clusters where the working courtyards are, and that's where those ground floors can spill out into those maker spaces. And alongside those, essentially those sort of small buildings, we wanted to start to activate some of those ground uses, as well as though there being workshops. So the idea was that you could have some food and beverage and a cafe, you could have some retail, and that while they might not immediately come in, there was the flexibility within those floor plates to activate those ground floors and make it a city space. The other important aspect is that the district is fully pedestrianised. So there is a service route to allow for servicing, and that's at fixed hours. So you can have deliveries coming in at out of hours. So if you were a furniture maker and you're getting your furniture collected, that is pre-booked. The daily deliveries are organised by vehicles coming up to the side of the district, and then the guys kind of delivering packages to the builders individually. So minimising vehicle circulation was a must. There's plenty of bicycle parking, so it's very much focused on the pedestrian environment. And then there were some other constraints to take into, which one being the Silvertown Tunnel, which is a major project coming. So the 2 buildings to the southern edge of the district will come in the future. And also linking into the Tide, which is at the time we were doing this project, an old slide was called the P5K, but the Tide is a major walkway by Dilys Cofidio, which loops all around the peninsula, and it needs to tie into the district in the future on that eastern edge. Now, we had the framework established, we had a brief for our architects, we had a sort of master plan which was emerging. The thing to do next was for us to pick the architects, and as a development business, you can imagine that from my perspective on the design side, it took quite a lot of convincing to the development team that we would work with 8 architects all at once. But what we wanted to do was try and create a real mix of styles, and we did that purposely. We wanted to juxtapose these different voices and create what I sort of refer to as wit and mess, and that cities are messy places. They are full of different idiosyncrasies of different types of buildings. And so one of actually the precedents that we used to use and talk about for the project was Neal's Yard in Covent Garden, where you sort of walk down a little side passage and the courtyard opens up, and there's lots of different colours, lots of different details within the buildings, and it really lends itself to that sort of character. So we were trying to capture that. And I think often if you were to ask someone which bit of city they like best, or which is their favourite part of London, for example, they are more likely to choose, let's say, a part of Camden or Southwark, or a favourite courtyard in Clerkenwell. And so when you're doing a project completely from scratch, we were trying to find a way within that design process to capture the sort of the grain that you get, which is built up over a long period of time, but to try and see that into the development right from the off. So each architect's got exactly the same brief, a different plot, and you can see that the architects never got a neighbouring plot from the diagram. And then we asked them to work blind. So we knew that they knew each other, we knew that they would talk to each other a little bit, but the idea was that we wanted them to really use their own voice. That's why we picked them. So they went away, they worked up their concepts. I'll run through the buildings very quickly so you can see. I don't think we've got time to go through all, but I'll give you a snapshot of what's emerged. But what they did share was a consultant team. So all the engineers, the M&E, access, all of that was the same consultant team behind the architect. So where we could find commonality between the buildings, so lessons that could be learnt in terms of structures or in terms of fire escapes, that was then fed into the other projects. And actually, as a team, Slack was used on the project, and we had all these streams of conversations going around different topics, and it proved to be an incredibly useful design tool in terms of allowing the teams to know what else was going on. So what we used to do is send these guys away for a couple of weeks, and as we had our design team meetings, a model was brought in each week and they would piece these things together. Now, they didn't necessarily know what was going on, but as a client, we were aware. So I think where we felt that there were moments of serendipity that happened, we were able to kind of capture those and hold on to them, even if they didn't necessarily know what their neighbor was doing. And I'll try and mention one as we go through the images. Now, I haven't done these in an order of preference. I've decided I'd do them alphabetically. That was probably the fairest way to go through. So this is 6A, and actually they treated their buildings both exactly the same. They chamfered the facade backwards to take advantage of the northwest light. The top floor here is a 7.5 meter high studio, so it's a great event space, a great natural light. In fact, we've got a photography studio looking at one of the spaces now. And the buildings are a pair, so I'll show you that one in a second, which is green, this is red. They're terrazzo covered with an aluminium facade to the other three sides of the building. Now, when they chamfered their building, Barozzi Vega at the time, in their building in the background, we had put in this huge corner window. Now, they didn't know that 6A was chamfering their building as such, but what it did was create this wonderful vista down the street. And so that was one of those moments of serendipity that occurred, where you had these elements that just arose, sort of by chance, and then I guess engineered by us on the way through. But they were great to sort of see as they came forward. This is the other sort of pair of the buildings, and 6A really did talk about a pair of buildings, the buildings that are down at the Greenwich Maritime Museum that are seen as a pair. They're pairs of London buses, two that always come along at once. And so that was a sort of theme that ran through, whereas other architects treated their buildings separately. Architecture 00, they wrap their buildings in mesh, so all the circulation on this building is outside. And that actually arose out of an argument with one of the development managers who said that they had too much circulation inside their building and not enough rentable area. So they put all the circulation outside. And they, in doing so, they allowed access to a public basketball court that sits on the roof. And this is the sister building. Again, this is D1, also wrapped in a metal mesh. And it has a sort of pockets of that external terraces. Assemblage is now called, the practice is now called HNNA. They rebranded this year, but they created this curving facade that allowed views in all different directions. Again, they took advantage of great top ceiling heights. They had this sort of big vaulted space at the top, and actually a double height space at ground floor addressing the main, this is the main square where there's a cafe restaurant. And this is the sister building right to the south of the site. And this has, again, some external circulation, but really great studios overlooking the park. With this metal mesh, this is to provide some solar shading to those spaces. Barozzi Vega, this is a building that actually has already opened and has our first tenant, which is Ravensbourne Art College, who've taken this as their Institute of Creativity, which is their new postgrad and commercial offer coming out of Ravensbourne Art College. And this was really about simplifying the form of their building as much as they could. So they pared back, it was all about the massing and the end elevation, paring it back to the most simple form they could. And then they spent a lot of time playing around with the size of the windows and openings to create the spaces. And this roof space, this top floor also has a 5.5 meter high ceiling height on the top. So a really great space. And this is the sister building again. Pretty much the same configuration, the same work on the end of the elevation. It's just clad in a different aluminium cladding. So this is black rather than the silver. Adam Kahn's buildings. So this is a building that is concrete, poured in situ. You can see it just steps out subtly on each floor, but the walls are also poured in situ as well as the slab. So this was all about that construction process, all about how the details were sort of evolved out of the shuttering, and also leaving the imprints of the sort of the mess and some of the sort of imperfections that you get from that process of pouring concrete. This is the other building to the south of the park. Now, initially, he was hoping to clad this in metal at the time when he first conceived it, but because the Silvertown tunnel sits underneath, we looked at changing this to a timber structure. And so now actually this is a timber slatted CLT structure with a sort of candy colored facade, which really refers to, I think, a couple of artists that they were looking at in terms of getting inspiration for that cladding. This is David Kahn's building, so lots of postmodernist influence here, big heavy bases which were inspired by the Dockland buildings in Liverpool. You can see the facade developed was influenced by the Maison de Verre as well, the James Sterling red coming in, the sort of Hollywood Design District sign on the top. Also corner plinths for sculptures to come forward. So David was very influenced by the guilds and the guilds in Venice, the scuole, and the role of sculpture on those buildings. So he's allowed for this sort of figurative pieces to be brought onto the corners of each of those buildings, and the same for the other building, also on the western facade, which follows the same theme. Mole Architects. So this building, there used to be, unfortunately it's recently been taken down by Greenwich, but there used to be a fantastic gas holder on the peninsula. And the form of this building is inspired by the drum that sits within the gas holder. That's that step shape that you get. And it's clad in core 10. And the reason for the core 10 was that Meredith at Mole was interested in looking at the range of colors that you get in a gas flame. And so this was the orange that you get when you burn a gas flame. And the other building is clad in it's a metal cladding that has sort of dichroic finish to the paint. So this sort of glows greeny blue. And so both these buildings were meant to be seen together as the flame of a gas fire. And then Salgascano, so this is an office building, or the sort of a workspace building, and you can see it sort of very much picks up on their play on biophilia. There's a sort of winter garden to the other side. This has this sort of amazing seats that sort of stick out into the main square. So it's full of colour and planting. And here is their other building, which is the Market Hall. So this is a building which is covered in ETFE. It has 6 market stalls for food market and a bar, and you can climb up onto a raised platform at this level, which is filled with trees, and the roof of the food hall also opens up to the elements. So in good weather, it will be open to the sun. And the good weather. Here's an example of the working courtyard, and another one. So this is the sense of these sort of spaces opening up, and that then is the whole of the district as you see it. So the phase we're at now is we're close to completing, and we are now very much out to market. So as I said, Ravensbourne Art College have taken a space. The key for us is, I guess, we designed this pre-COVID. And we are now looking for tenants in the sort of, as we come out of that, hopefully, as we're coming out the other side. So for us, it's about having a flexibility of types of spaces. We have multi-purpose spaces. We have small units, which that's a sort of 2-3 people. We have a service studio offer, which we're calling the Bureau, which is essentially a co-working offer where you can either have a lounge membership or a hot desk. You can even book an office space for 3 days a week. So if you're now working on those flexible hours, we have a kind of flexible offer in terms of a studio space. We have, like Ravensbourne, a couple of companies looking at taking a whole building. And then the on-off office was this idea that you could have a sort of flexible lease. One of the things that we're also doing is trying to make the process as simple as possible. So there's one clear cost. The lease document can be read by the business owner, who is also probably doing all the admin and all those elements within the business. That's often the case for small independents. And so we want to make it as simple as possible so that people can get on and do what they want to do, which is design or make or be creative. And the other thing that we're doing at the moment is, as part of attracting tenants, the first 12 months is at just £5 a square foot for tenants coming in. Now, the idea behind the district is that the average, there's a blended rate which we're looking to target, which is £25 a square foot across the whole district. But what that allows us to do is, for example, a tenant taking a whole building will do a bit more heavy lifting than someone that might be a maker or an artist. So they will pay more rent to cross-subsidise an artist or a maker who isn't able to pay as much rent. So some of the things then that are about attracting people coming in, the canteen we think is a big pull, and obviously we hope to attract people who are coming to the O2 as well. So that's very much a big public offering. The bureau, which is this co-working space, and that allows us a way of managing all the events and programming that happen across the district. So whether that's access to the basketball court, whether that's access to events, workshops, and it's really about managing that ecosystem in terms of getting tenants in and enjoying those spaces, and also allowing us to work out where connections can be made. You know, we're as interested in, let's say, a patent lawyer coming in to help designers, or whether you are a great bookkeeper and that people are looking for some legal advice or financial advice, that they're very much part of that ecosystem. And just to give you a short update on some construction images. So this is the district as it looked last year during lockdown. And this is a photograph from last week. So you can see the Mole building in the middle in the foreground, 6A's building at the, and our Barozzi Vega at the back. Assemblage's building on the left, the market hall just in that middle, and 00 the basketball court. Here is one of those courtyards. This is from so the Mole building, the bureau, what will be one of the bureau buildings in the distance by Assemblage, and the market hall on the right. There's the metal mesh of the architecture 00. And this is then looking back, I think, from Barozzi Vega building, looking back up to the O2. There you can see the terrazzo going in on the facade. There's the Ravensbourne building, looking pretty much like the CGI, I hope. That's then the market hall from the main square as you come past going towards the O2. So that's what you'll see. And there it is, again, with the ETFE literally just gone on, being stretched into position. This is an example of one of the spaces in 6A building. And here is one of the CLT spaces in Mole's buildings. So that is where we've got to. And I'm very happy to take some questions on how we're bringing it forward and what the challenges have been in terms of sort of getting it to its end state and getting tenants in. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Matthew. And I love the idea of all those architects all beavering away and trying not to look at what the others are doing. We've had some questions come in. I'm going to just put one of them to you now, and then we can discuss other stuff later. And this is on the question of flexibility. And you gave us a great explanation of the, the sort of different tenure types and the different types of people that could come in. But how flexible do you see this beyond the creative people? I mean, what if in, say, 20 years' time, that wasn't wanted? Could this, for example, be converted into housing?
I think, well, we've got a lot of housing coming forward on the peninsula. So I think we'd had seen this as being an environment for creatives and makers, and that's very much been set out in partnership with the GLA on the project. So we hope that would stay. I mean, one of the reasons to have those smaller buildings was that we hoped that they would preclude certain sizes of organisations coming to those buildings, that they would be attractive very much for small independents. And I think the other thing that it allowed us to do is, because the buildings were designed for non-residential use, we were actually able to sort of get some proximities between those buildings, some of those small alleyways, which I don't think we would have done had we been designing with residential in mind.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I suppose the reason the question's asked is that, you know, if you look at, say, 19th century warehouse buildings, which obviously people thought were going to be warehouses forever, and they found a great range of new uses, haven't they? So I guess it's just that looking with legacy in mind. But you're
Yeah, I mean,
confident that
I think,
these will remain.
The idea that I think they, you know, they were made to be adaptable, and the idea was that tenants would knock them about. I mean, I think the architects, I think you could feel as the buildings are completing, are feeling a bit more nervous about tenants coming in and putting up a partition or nailing something into a wall. But I think for us, it's about the neighbourhood as well. And so because it's part of a piece of wider city making, the notion that you have a range of those different neighbourhoods, a range of different spaces, that yes, they will be adaptable, but I think rather than seeing it as a sort of an individual project, we always see it within that much wider context of the whole peninsula as well, and how it sits within that. And so that's, I think, where the sort of balance of residential and work and stuff is a bit sort of broader.
And we've got more questions about the peninsula, but I'm going to ask those to you later. Thanks very much indeed, because now I'm going to introduce our third speaker. Before I do, I just remind everyone, please to send in questions if you have them. And now I'm going to hand over to Philip Turner, Director at AHMM.
Thanks very much for asking me to join today's Architecture Today webinar. I'm delighted to be here, albeit in a virtual way, and I think there's the opportunity to answer questions in a real live way at the end of this. So I'll try and run through a relatively short presentation that I hope gives an architect's account of anticipatory architecture and complements the other presentations that are being given in conjunction. My name's Philip Turner. Here I am. I put this slide in because I wasn't sure if we were going to be recorded as just disembodied voices, but you can see me, so I'm going to move on quickly. I work as a director here at Orchard Hall Monaghan Morris in London, but also in Bristol and in the States, in Oklahoma. We've been working for a very long time in all kinds of buildings to try to figure out, I guess, how to make buildings that really do survive, adapt, get better over time. And that's what Jonathan Stock of Architecture Today asked me to have a think about in preparation for today's presentation. And specifically, he asked me to think about buildings when the only certainty is change, which seemed, when he talked to me, quite a familiar theme, which I'll go into in a moment. This is a catalogue of buildings that I've worked on over the last 20 years, but clearly, and they are buildings that you work in, they're buildings you live in, that you go to school in, that you exercise in, that you shop in, and all sorts of other things. So we're talking perhaps predominantly about places that you work today, but also about all of the other things that go into making people's lives and cities more and more fulfilling. I'm also going to talk, I guess, principally about our thoughts as a practice as architects in London, although the buildings on that previous slide are all over the country. And as I say, we work lots of other places, but because I think London can be seen as a kind of intensive laboratory at times, where change might happen sooner, it might happen quicker, where some of the constraints or some of the pressures on change are more intense, and therefore if one is to extrapolate what happens in the future, always a difficult job, it might be best seen through this lens. And London is, of course, a city that has grown very rapidly at times and continues to grow, albeit, I suppose, now inwardly rather than outwardly as it did in the past. And it grew without really planning, in a sense, I think, at times, how buildings would need to change over their lifetime. And our ability to foresee how buildings might be used, or to try to force buildings to be used, I guess, in one way or another, really crystallized just after the Second World War with the Abercrombie Plan. This, of course, brought with it government legislation about building use classes, brought in 1948 and updated ever since, quite radically in the last 12 months or so. And it wasn't until this point that we needed to even think about or designate how buildings might change their use or stay the same over time. This, by the way, is a map drawn by Erno Goldfinger in an explanatory guide to the London Plan of Shoreditch, really. And if I use the cursor, one can see this kind of boulevard idea here, resulting in a piece of kind of space that became Old Street Roundabout. And one of the buildings I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about 3 buildings, sits right there. So it's quite interesting to see how the organic hodgepodge London becomes, in the eyes of a planner, a much more organised place. I don't think it ever actually happened, thankfully, and instead London continues to be a much more radical and freewheeling place, especially I think in areas like Shoreditch, and a much more mixed up place than Abercrombie would have liked. Now here is a diagram of, if you like, or a cartoon really, of Cedric Price's. Cedric is an architect I'll talk about in a second, who Jonathan suggested that I had to think about in relation to this talk. And this is a classic slide. I mean, many people will know it, about the way in which cities are organised. And I think the one on the right, and this drawn in 1982, sort of says really where we are now in London. And I think where we will go even more now as we come out of this pandemic, and start to use the city in a different and potentially more personalised, more local way. And that ultimately informs the way that we have to design buildings. So Cedric Price isn't someone I pretend to know a huge amount about, although I was fortunate enough to meet him a few times to talk about work. And indeed, he used to crit when I was doing my architectural studies at UCL. And at that point, the ideas that he had pursued in different ways over a long time about buildings that anticipated change were very powerful. Generator is the name of one of his projects, which perhaps anticipates change more than any of the others, in that it instigates change before it is required by the user. They were projects often that achieved this level of flexibility or change through relatively high levels of servicing, effectively black box technology. You press a button and something changes. And in a way that affected the work that I produced at the time. This is an excerpt from a project that I did at UCL, where we tried to propose buildings that could be both places of work and places that you live, and indeed places that you went to in your spare time. But that the same building would change over the course of a day. Not only was it a relatively high-tech proposition, it was also a proposition that related to value, financial value, rather perhaps than, if you like, the personal choice of the user. And I think in both of these respects, times have changed a great deal over the last 20 years, since Cedric Price died and this project was done. And a lot of the work that we've done in practice, I think, pursues an agenda of loose fit change rather than highly serviced change. And of course, many of the buildings that we've worked on over the years prove this to be entirely achievable. So a familiar environment to me is the building our office is in, Moorlands in Clerkenwell, which is a 19th century factory. It's a steel frame building as it happens, with a brick skin that's proven very flexible over time. We've also taken a look at more high profile buildings, or more civic buildings in a way. This, the Duke of York's headquarters off the King's Road, built in a classical style, now as a barracks, now an art gallery for Charles Saatchi. There are a number of buildings where office buildings built in the 1960s or 70s have been changed into housing, specifically student housing in this case. There are also buildings in the 1960s built for very specific requirements, such as transport. This, alongside the Westway, becomes an office building. And then there's a building called the T building in Shoreditch, which in a sense does it better than any of them. A building bought by Derwent, our client here for 15 years on this project, as a building they thought they might knock down and replace with a brand new building, if you like, in a sort of Cedric Price way. Instead, turned out to be such a good, flexible, low-cost building that they could use it very differently, simultaneously and over time. So, of course, it becomes a place of work. It also becomes a place of leisure. It also becomes a place for private members club on the roof. And it will become many other things, I've no doubt, in the future. So we move away from a version of life where buildings are built with very specific needs, if you like the Abercrombie version of life, where cheerful cockneys come out of factories raising their hats and go home for their tea, to a version of life where buildings are used much less specifically. And so to look directly at the world of work, in this still from Jacques Tati's film Playtime, seen as being a horrible place in a sense, a more mechanistic place, or a very modern place perhaps, we move towards a much more, I think, freewheeling version of life. And in a sense that becomes a brief for the architect. And what I'd like to do now is therefore talk a bit more about how we now make new buildings. I have three case studies, if you like, which respond to the way in which we've learnt from buildings like T, which was once a tea warehouse and factory, but is now, as I say, when you take a look from the air, a very, very different kind of place. Along the way, we've pursued ideas, if you like, separate from the specific design of buildings, about how legislation might change, in order to try to create a regulatory environment where buildings that try to anticipate change and enable change can go through the system. But what I really think is now most pertinent to talk about is how you design them. This is a publicity image from Kubrick's 2001: Space Odyssey, where, as those of you who've seen the film will know, the bone thrown up in the air becomes, in a sense, the spaceship that man inhabits in space. And in a way, this sets up the kind of dual response that I think architects still have, should have, in relation to a brief for change or anticipating change. We've said at AHM for a long time that you therefore build buildings, you build them big, you build them simple, you build them naturally ventilated if at all possible, and you accept that the framework that you establish will always, within it, have a series of different uses, different stage sets. And of course, that as a fit out comes down ultimately to the level of the things that people take around with them during the day. So a big, simple frame can be inhabited, if generous enough, in a number of different ways. And those are the kinds of buildings that we think anticipate change the best. Three that we've built or will soon build, delivered over the course of 15 years or so, begin to track how an architectural response to that brief changes as we understand better, particularly how to address the climate change agenda and how to build as with a low carbon technology. So White Collar Factory is the first of these buildings. I shall go through it relatively quickly. It's a 10-year process to make this building, which I'll try to explain in 3 minutes. It sits at Old Street Roundabout from that Abercrombie plan. It replaced a building, or a pair of buildings really, Transworld House, that were of the 60s. Actually behind it there's a building of the 20s as well. They weren't particularly attractive, neither did they use the site particularly efficiently. They could not be reused, and that's in contrast to other buildings that we address now, where we try to keep as much as we can. And I'll come on to that in the next example. We developed, this is a prototype for White Collar Factory, built more or less on the roof of Transworld House at the back, and it was developed with the engineers Arup to try to establish a design for a building that used relatively small amounts of energy, gave user control to all of its occupants, not just, if you like, the person who runs the building on the day, and creates as delightful an environment internally as possible. So to look at that, we maximised for ceiling heights, we brought natural ventilation throughout the perimeter of the building, and we stripped out, wherever possible, finishes that only degrade and need to be replaced, which is ultimately both costly and energy intensive. In preparation for construction, a project we carried out, sorry about the low-res slide, with Morak Myskov, graphic designer who we collaborate with, was this 10-metre beach ball. It represents, if you like, a ton of carbon, and that is the amount of carbon that this building was designed to save every 2 days in comparison, if you like, with the industry benchmark at that time. So this sat on the podium roof until a storm arrived. It got loose and rolled around the Old Street roundabout until a member of Islington Council came and I think speared it and took it away. But the building itself that replaced it over a period of 3 years, 4 years, does an awful lot more than just become a kind of an icon. It is a building where, learning from that prototype, each facade is different. Each facade, depending on orientation, has a greater or lesser amount of shading. The core is on the south to shade the plan as far as it can. It's seen both from the roundabout on that previous slide, but also obliquely along Old Street in the context of buildings of other eras. When you enter it, you realise that the building's designed, if you like, on the basis of the previous best case environmental design strategy, which was the maximum amount of exposed thermal mass to moderate daytime temperatures and reduce energy use at peak demand times. Of course, you do that through concrete. You put concrete in most places, and we now know that concrete is very carbon hungry, or produces lots of carbon. Therefore, it is not necessarily the technology we would use again today. But a building of 10 years ago, looking to better industry benchmarks, led us to thermal mass exposed in cores and in the office spaces themselves, with, as I said before, an approach to zero dilapidation, zero waste over time. And that is another consideration we come back to in a moment when we design buildings today. At the top of the building, there are some double height spaces, and there is the traffic light system. If you can see there, the red traffic light at the top, this is for all users, and it's linked to the way in which the building's services are controlled, and it tells you whether or not it's a good day to open a window. So if it's too hot outside or too cold, and you therefore boost the need for cooling or heating and the energy consumption of the building, it says red, and you rely on the systems. If it's moderate, sort of mid-season outside, then it goes green and lets you know what to do. We also designed a system here in plywood, which we call Project Jack, for the fit out of 3 floors towards the bottom of the building for the office group, which is a reusable plywood partitioning system. So here we're attempting not only to follow through the architectural spirit of the building, but also to create a flexible system of fit out that can be reused over time. Because of course, we can consider and control the amount of carbon produced by the building in its original construction, but it is quite difficult to control it over time. And systems like this, we believe, will help. At the top of the building, just talking about things that aren't just work, there's a running track for the occupants, the people who work there, and a little sort of club room. And thankfully, you can see quite empty plant rooms for tenants, which indicates base build provision is sufficient. Here's a picture of the running track. And the ground floor, and this relates back to this wider conversation about the city, there's a landscaped yard, which itself, I'm going to try and use the cursor here. So this is a base white collar factory, links through Old Street to another project we did more or less at the same time across the main road called the Bower. And here, therefore, you find an off Main Street route for pedestrians through from City Road up towards Moorfields. And so these projects become more than just a single piece of architecture, they become a piece of city. It's interesting just for a moment to look at this in the context of our own occupation. AHMM, as I said, are in this building called Moorlands, which is about 500 metres away from White Collar Factory. We have actually now taken space in White Collar Factory. So on the left is our office here in a Victorian building, and on the right is our office in a brand new build, relatively new building, both of which actually pursue the same goals, which is tall, well-lit, well-ventilated spaces with lots of user control. And we've used Project Jack in our own meeting room fit out and so on there. So following White Collar Factory, we began working on the post building, now complete, for Brockton and Oxford, further towards the West End. It's on Museum Street and High Holborn, just east of Centre Point and Tottenham Court Road. This building is in part a refurbishment, unlike White Collar Factory. It uses the bones of this building, the previous building on the site, a sorting office built for the Royal Mail in the 1960s. And the amazing thing about this, apart from all the details about the Underground Railway and so on, is that this building was built because it had an industrial function rather than a more straightforward office function. It was built tremendously generously. It had a huge concrete frame, had very tall floor to ceilings. It had industrial equipment that looked more like a tech fit out than ever. And we were able to reuse parts of it, particularly at lower levels, but also the spirit of this building and the generosity in the way in which we rebuilt part of the frame above ground, and then ultimately created new architectural identity within the city. The eventual tenant is McKinsey, a firm of management consultants, and which shows, I guess, the change in London over 50 years as much as anything else. But they were attracted, as many other firms here in the eastern part of London are, to generous user, sensibly user-controlled spaces. The building on the outside is a patinated steel made by Metalbau Früh in Germany. It has its entrance here on the quieter Museum Street on the west side. A very, very grand lobby. So this is all about height, generosity, and these things lead over time, we believe, to the flexibility that enables change without demolition, without the costs that come with it, environmental and financial. Photographs here of the lift lobby, for example, the ground floor, begin to show the simple steel core inserted through the building. And this photograph and the next one show the office environment that's created. So this environment is more akin, I think, to an industrial environment than it is, if you like, a traditional office. In contrast to White Collar Factory, it is effectively a sealed building with a high level of servicing. The retention of existing structure saved nearly 2,000 tonnes of carbon. That sounds great. It's nowhere near enough, actually. And the next project that I'll show tries to demonstrate how a new building now addresses that in a more radical way. But ultimately, this building, with its very generous spaces, should, we believe, now set up a new 100-year lifespan, which can accommodate things that we don't anticipate at this point in time. At the top of the building, a series of generous roof terraces also add to the city's biodiversity. And I think as the agenda moves ever closer towards our effect on the environment, these spaces, seen here before people really took occupation, seen here during lockdown, become ever more important. So the third project, Belgrave House, is at King's Cross. This is the view as you come out of the railway station. It isn't built. This is a rendering, but it is in production now and due to go to site next year. This building is part offices, part laboratories, and it is a new built building. But it attempts to address the carbon agenda in a way that neither of the previous projects did. Here is a section that shows not only is it on top of the tube, not only is it opposite St Pancras Chambers, which is a beautiful, very well listed building, and indeed King's Cross Station, but this drawing describes the building's uses very clearly. So there is a kind of public ground floor. There are 3 floors of laboratories. This is for an American medical technology firm called MSD, who are currently in the Crick just around the corner. There is a collaboration floor for them, and then offices at the top. The building's structure must be extremely resilient up to this point because of the medical technologies that are in use, particularly microscopes and things like that. So this is very rigid. This can be more flexible. This is an aerial view, and this is a little cartoon that says how much carbon we think we could save during construction. So up to the point of completion, there are 7,250 of these grey balls here, grey spheres, each the same size as Morag Myerscott's cheerful beach ball. So the saving here is radically better than the buildings that we've worked on previously. The way in which we've assessed it and designed it is with reference to the RIBA's whole life carbon assessment. There are a number of different ways of looking at this out there at the moment. We've used this, and the bit that we, to use the cursor again, that we can really affect traditionally is the blue bit, which is what everything that happens to construction. But by building buildings that can change over time, it is everything to the red bit, because that's the end of fit out. The yellow orangey bits are the building's energy in use. And of course, the carbon associated with that thankfully decreases all the time as the grid is decarbonised, but it puts ever greater pressure on the red and the blue. So the design that we've brought forward, even though it has a concrete frame at lower levels for those laboratories, beats the RIBA target for 2020, falls slightly short of the RIBA target for 2025, but is considerably better than the current industry standard in terms of tons of carbon per metre squared. And we've also been able, working with Atelier 10, to look at operational carbon. So, conscious of time, I'm just going to flick to this slide, which says, of course, we understand better now how things use power in the buildings, and thankfully heating and cooling is a relatively minor amount now. This slide explains how we compare with the Part L 2013 benchmark. Thankfully now one we're all moving away from and looking forward to the new Part L. The dashed line is the London plan. Be lean and be clean takes us close to the London plan, and being green, bringing on site PVs and air source heat pumps, gets us well below it. So we end up with a 43% carbon saving below the current industry benchmark. And of course, a building that we hope is, in a sense, emblematic of that. One of the aspects of this building which doesn't relate immediately to the carbon calculator, but is nevertheless, we think, very important to the user, is the use of planting, biophilia if you want, and the facades here at upper levels are a twin skin with a planted zone between inner and outer. The lower floors, the laboratories, where potentially future vaccines are manufactured, are highly visible, and because they face north, thankfully, shading is not as much of a problem, a new tube station in the corner. So that takes me through the three case studies. To wrap up, I suppose one has to look forward to what might happen next, and we are undoubtedly at an amazing point. While the carbon and environmental agenda is critical and something where buildings will only get better and must try harder, that we're also at a moment, I think, where we use the city in a different way, going back to Cedric Price's scrambled egg rather than his designs for buildings, to say that I think we will begin to use buildings and places in an ever more personalised way. And in a sense, that is a very Cedric Price thing. I think he had a passionate desire for to improve the human condition. However, architecture might help to do that. But I think that ultimately personalisation and non-specificity becomes the most important way to allow buildings to stay there for a long time and therefore to reduce their environmental impact. It's not just what it is, it's what you do with it. And as ever, I think the last word probably does go to Cedric Price. Here is an image from his sketchbooks for that generator project that I mentioned earlier. And I really enjoyed this little note on the side, if you can read it: shelter, but not too much. And I think in a sense that describes a condition that we should all aim for in the way that we use our buildings and our cities, because whatever it is we're doing, I think we have to remain as ambitious as possible, and a slight amount of discomfort always, I think, helps that process along.
Thanks so much, Philip, and thank you very much for sharing those projects with us. We've got some questions that have come in. It's still not too late to ask another one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put one very specific question to Philip, and then I'm going to have some more questions which I think we can have as a more general discussion with our panel. So you showed on the white collar building, you showed the partition system that you designed, which looked great. But somebody asked the question, and it rang a lot of bells with me: will people actually use them and relocate them? Because it seems to me people have been designing so-called relocatable partitions for years, and they always get torn down and thrown away in the first refit.
Well, I mean, the calculation we did at the time was that it would pay for itself after a single relocation. That was a financial thing rather than an energy thing. But clearly, one move probably beats throwing everything in the skip in terms of material cost as well. Have we seen it? No, not fully. I should say that Project Jack, the name we gave to that project, is something that we've developed in conjunction with Google, who we've done a lot of work for on buildings over the years, and they have moved theirs around more than the office group have at White Collar. I think linking it back to the very first presentation, which I found fascinating about the way in which Cushman Wakefield, I think, will be coming back to the office now. I would hope that relocatable systems like that begin to prove their worth as we re-inhabit office spaces.
Thanks so much. I hope you're right. Okay, we've had a number of questions which come in around everything from where's the nearest tube station to the Greenwich development, to questions about, you know, what's happening to shopping streets. And I think what that all actually relates to, and this is what I'd like to ask you, is how we use our cities and how that's changing. I mean, we've seen everything from that sort of Cedric Price drawing of not too much shelter. Despina sort of mentioned third spaces, and then of course that sort of set along the sort of death of retail. And although we've seen building designs which, as fairly substantial office buildings perhaps, are opening themselves out more to the street, I wonder how you're thinking how it's going to work in terms of those third spaces, and how the sort of cities and probably the suburbs as a whole should function in our new working ecosystem. I think I'll throw that to Despina first.
Interesting and long question. I think it's something going back to legislative change that Philip mentioned that I want to pick up on, because I think planning and legislation is really important here about changing use and being able to reapply new types of uses to spaces to create environments that actually blur those boundaries of working, living, and learning. I think one of the locations in the ecosystem that I described was local work, and the ability to have the characteristics of being able to cycle or work to work provide opportunities to reinvent the high street in different ways. But that will require planning change to make it happen. So I think we need to think about cities from a people perspective, and that, you know, human experience rather than a more prescriptive way we've done in the past.
Thank you. I'm going to throw that to Matthew in a slightly different way, because you're putting your creative district within a lot of housing, and I'm wondering kind of who you're expecting and hoping is going to use that, and whether I mean, I think it's great that actually you're talking about wanting places where people are also making things, and there's physical stuff coming in and out. But do you imagine that this is going to be sort of largely used and worked in by people who are living around about, or is it going to be, if you like, people's sort of first space, second space, third space? I just wonder how you see it fitting within both Greenwich Peninsula and the larger city.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us it has to work on both scales, and I think since we started this project, I guess for us it's about extending not just it's not about just Greenwich Peninsula, but Greenwich Borough as a whole, and so your North Greenwich station is very important in terms of transit into the city, and it's a bus terminus, so it's a way a lot of people transition from buses onto the Jubilee line to then go into town. So we know that there's that really important catchment that goes out beyond to Charlton, to Blackheath. We know that there's great creative communities emerging south of the river, and actually there's been a sort of lack of provision for them in that sense. So on one level, we see that local pull and that ability to have a base, to have somewhere to work, and for a lot of people, we would like them to come to be creative and to be working each day, but it's also about having a place that you might not want to go all the way into the city. You might want to have a sort of a closer base to have, and that might be something that you might want to use those facilities for a couple of meetings, or to have a place where you can be for a day. So that's part of the appeal. And obviously, given that we're such a sort of new neighborhood for London as a whole, it's also about having a point of difference and a reason to come to the peninsula. One of our great advantages on the site, and I think our residents have seen it or experienced it over the course of the last 12 months especially, is the river, is having this wonderful amenity and this wonderful outside space to experience. But at the same time, it also creates a barrier in terms of how we integrate into the rest of the urban fabric to the north of the site. So to have reasons to come, we sort of say reasons to come and then reasons to stay. And so the design district is a reason to come, and hopefully the homes are then a reason to stay.
Thank you. And I saw Philip nodding while you were doing that answer. And so I'm going to go back to him. And I think one of the things, I mean, tell us what you want to say and your view on it, of course. But I think also, if we're going to have those third spaces, if we're going to have small places where people can congregate, and presumably they're not necessarily going to be sort of huge WeWork in the suburbs, I'm just interested to know who's going to design them, because I'm guessing it's not quite what you design, is it? Or maybe it is, and maybe it should be.
Well, we've worked on a series of buildings at a sort of new suburban town at Alconbury, which is one of these brownfield sites nearish to London, commutable, where lots of people put houses, but very few people put places to work. So we've done, and I've worked on 4 buildings there on that site now for work, none of them bigger than sort of 10,000 square feet, all of which are intended to incubate small businesses and provide places to work near home. So I don't think it's out of the question, but I take your point, Ruth. Obviously AHMM and the buildings I've shown are, more substantial. So I can't answer your question about who's going to work on them, and I hope there's a place for us, and I hope there's lots of success for the people who've done great buildings in the design district at North Greenwich as well. But what I was nodding about, which I think it was really nice to see it backed up in the statistics, really, Despina had at the beginning, is that there has been a lot of crystal ball gazing going on, hasn't there? Since the very beginning, there have been a lot of people walking around saying they know exactly what it's going to be like after COVID, and I don't think any of them really do still. But the plea that I would put in is a plea for sort of common sense, which is that, and this is, it seemed to me to be in those statistics, you said it yourself, that it was nice to see sort of reassurance that your gut feel is right, that loads of things that people used to do that they didn't really want to do, like getting on the Central Line at 8 o'clock in the morning and squishing yourself into a carriage along with everyone else, you know, or working in an office 5 days a week when really you wanted to pick your kids up from school on a Friday, are now a thing of the past. And they're officially a thing of the past because we've got statistics to go with it. And I know a lot of businesses and occupiers, therefore, that know they will have better staff, more productive, happier staff if they follow this kind of line. That's what I was really nodding about. And I think North Greenwich might provide a very useful kind of prototype in a way, perhaps, Matthew, just because you find, as you said, you have a lot of housing, you also have very good transport connections, but by placing jobs there, you start to create a real, and obviously there's great leisure facilities, you've got a bit of Cedric Price's kind of scrambled egg city where everything can happen in one place.
Thank you very much. We're really coming to the end of this, which is a shame because we've been getting some more specific questions coming in about things like how you deal with fire in very open buildings, people who are interested to know more about the cladding on some of the buildings in Greenwich. And I think perhaps some of those questions could be forwarded to the speakers if they'd like to respond to them later. But I guess that when it comes to technical issues, they're incredibly important. But if we all want to work and live in different ways, there always is a solution. I think what we've had today is a feeling not only of how much things are changing, but how ready various parts of the profession are becoming to deal with change, including, as I mentioned at the beginning, of course, the unknowable change, designing for the unknowable. Thank you very much to our speakers for such a fascinating session. Thank you to Despina Katsikakis. Thank you to Matthew Dearlove, and thank you to Philip Turner. And thank you as well, on behalf of Architecture Today, to all the people who have been watching this and who've sent in such good questions. Thank you also to Schüco, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day.